Thank you. Thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Izzy and I use she, they pronouns, and I'm joining us from the lands of the Whadjuk Noongar people here in Western Australia. I'm proud to be your guide for this webinar and I'll be helping facilitate this important discussion on inclusion in early childhood. So before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that even though we're meeting virtually, I'm meeting from the lands of the Whadjuk Noongar people. We would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we work, live and play. We pay deep respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. It always was, always will be Aboriginal land. There is also no justice without First Nations justice. I'd like to encourage everyone watching to pop in the chat what lands they're joining from. All right, so in today's webinar, we're going to be summarising CYDA's approach to these webinars. This is the end of a series of webinars. I will be discussing how children and young people can be supported and positioned as the experts of their own disability. We'll also be overviewing what to consider in the first few years of school. And then after this, we'll have a 5-minute break. And then we will come back together and discuss how some students may do school differently. And finally, we'll answer some audience questions and have some final reflections. So just to discuss CYDA's approach to webinars, so CYDA believes hearing directly from young people with their disabilities about experiences helps families, caregivers and communities to have high expectations and aspirations for all children. During this and other webinars, we use content notes to warn about ableism or discrimination. People can choose not to hear the sensitive information. If you feel that this webinar brought up some difficult or uncomfortable feelings for you, please do reach out for support. We'll put the names of some supports in the chat. This webinar also has Auslan interpreting and captions, and please use the Q&A function to ask your questions. If you have any technical issues, please privately message our webinar support person, Liz or Maddie, in the chat. So to access all of the webinars in this series, which you can see on the right-hand side, please go to our CYDA website page. We also have the CYDA YouTube for recordings. Materials are on a Google Drive. And please also share your feedback on the sessions via SurveyMonkey. Links for all of those have just been posted in the chat. So you've heard from myself, but today we also have with us Ashley and Georgia, and from the CYDA team we have Sue, Liz and Maddie. So I'm now going to ask the panelists to introduce themselves, and each person will also share with you what's your favourite memory of your school years. So I'll pass that on to Ashley.
Hi everyone. So yeah, like they said, my name's Ashley. I'm coming from Ngunnawal land here in southern Canberra, and I guess my favorite school memory. I know I said this in the last webinar, but I'm going to mention it again. I really liked going to Healthy Harold in my early primary school years, so I'll say that. And now I'll pass it on to Georgia.
Hi, my name's Georgia, and for me, my favourite school memory would have to be the teachers that were supportive.
Thanks, Georgia. My name is Sue. I work for CYDA. Very excited to be part of this session today and hear directly from Georgia, Ashley and Izzy about their experiences. My favourite school memory is one particular teacher, and this probably says more about my sense of humour. I remember the year was 1985, and the teacher, who was probably at the end of their teaching career, expressed the view that anybody that needed a microphone to sing wasn't a real singer. And I found that a fascinating idea. Anyway, I will pass over to Liz.
Hello everyone, my name's Liz. I'm also from CYDA. I use the pronoun she, her, and a visual description of myself. I have blonde grey hair, I'm wearing a black top, and I've got a blurred background of a painting from Vietnam in my background. And one of my favorite school activities was I really enjoyed swimming and swimming lessons. And I'll hand over to Maddie.
Maddie speaking. Hello, my name is Maddie. I also work at CYDA and my pronouns are she, her, and I'm calling from Wurundjeri country. So a brief visual description of myself. I have pale skin and long brown hair tied up in a ponytail. I'm wearing a denim jacket. And I think the most exciting thing about my outfit is that I have a little badge that has a whale and an astronaut connected by a chain. So it looks like they're floating in space. And a good memory of my time at school was definitely participating in all the dance and drama productions that the students got to design and put together. And I will hand back to you, Izzy.
Thank you, Maddie. In terms of a visual description for myself, so I have red hair today, I tan skin, I'm of Asian descent, and I'm wearing a green top. And my favorite childhood memory is I really enjoyed walking to and from school with my siblings because everyone lived very locally at our primary school, and so it was sort of like a bus. Everyone would join in from their houses, and it was very fun. All right, I will pass on to Sue.
Sue speaking. Thanks, Izzy. We wanted to kick off with our first topic, and on the slide that I'll get Maddie to jump to, thank you, are just a couple of prompt ideas about this topic, but I just want to introduce the topic first. So we wanted to discuss with you and share the young person's experience around the development of children and young people being the experts in their own disability. And I suppose the opportunities to start that as early as possible in the child's life. So the simple ideas that we've got on the slide there, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more because we're going to hear from each young person about their experience and their suggestions, is to stop, to listen, and to ask. So fairly simple concepts, but as Izzy will share with us next, can be quite challenging. The other thing that we wanted to reflect on in this topic is the role of language. So in the first webinar that we ran earlier this year, we talked about the role of language and how children and young people with disability begin to identify how they speak about themselves. And how they communicate with others. And obviously, they're going to learn that from the people closest to them. So we were wanting to raise the concerns or raise the focus about making sure that you're, as family members or people working with young children, to think about how you speak about disability. And an easy way to explain this is obviously from a strengths-based and not necessarily from a deficit point of view. So we'll go into that a little bit more. But the other thing on the slide is practice and practice. Now, obviously that means practice for the young child and opportunities to practice, but also for family members as well, because it is something to get used to doing. So what I might do is hand over to Izzy first and get your thoughts on this area. So some of the questions I've asked the young people to think about is, how can families get into a headspace or get into a position where they're balancing looking after their child's needs and actually asking their child what they want? So Izzy, really keen to hear from you as to your reflections on this first, please.
Izzy speaking. Thank you, Sue. I guess my sort of perspective is informed by multiple sort of channels, and what I'd like to sort of set out first is I work a lot with other young people with disabilities, and I'm also a person with disability myself, and particularly around self-advocacy. And I've had a lot of very interesting conversations where young people have not been taught the language to explain their experiences. They haven't been allowed to explain their experiences or haven't been given that sort of agency. And then finally, a lot of young people with disabilities are often this isn't necessarily the right word, but I'm going to say it anyway, sort of coddled or kept very secure. So I'll sort of address each of those. But firstly, I wanted to address sort of coddling, I guess. There's this thing called dignity of risk. And the idea is that if a young person is never allowed to take a risk, or they're always told, you know, if they have an idea of like, oh, I want to go and do this activity, and they're like, no, you can't do that, it's not safe for you because of your disability. You might not necessarily tell your young person that it's not safe because of their disability, but there is that tendency to hold, you know, your child close and to make sure that they're safe. But what eventually ends up happening is as they grow up, they don't have those skills of learning, you know, what are their capabilities, what can they do, what might they need to ask for help in. So it's really important to allow your child to always explore and always take risks. Obviously you're there to support them, but I guess don't get into that mentality of, oh, I can't let them do anything. Secondly, I think it's around providing agency at every given moment. So what I mean is, you know, not just in treatment, but especially in treatment, asking the child what they want. I often talk of one of my colleagues who is deaf and was raised in an all hearing sort of family. And so they were pushed very heavily into getting a hearing aid or a hearing device, which they didn't want at all. They wanted to learn Auslan and to communicate that way. But because they were in a hearing family, they weren't given that choice. So even regarding treatment, always check in with your child. Is this what they want? Are they comfortable here? If they're not, there are other treatment options to explore. And then lastly, always asking, so giving your child the language to use. So that's things like, you know, if your child is upset or in pain, asking where is that coming from, giving them language to describe. It can be helpful, for example, getting a feelings chart, having a list of simple words to explain or to point to and be like, this is how I'm feeling today, this is where it hurts in my body, all those sorts of things. Because if you don't start encouraging that sort of language to be able to self-advocate, it can be more and more difficult. And I especially found in my own disability journey that it wasn't until I started learning the language of community and the language that other people understood that I could actually self-advocate, because until then I was trying to explain things that other people didn't understand. For example, I get very exhausted and I get episodes of exhaustion, but I was using the word tired around other people. And so when I was trying to explain my episodes and then I was going to have an episode and I was saying, I'm very tired, people were like, oh yeah, we're all tired, you know, and didn't take me seriously. Yeah, so I will pass on to the next person.
Can I just, sorry, Sue speaking, can I ask a clarifying question? Izzy, you talked about treatment and obviously supporting young children to find the words to express how they feel about that experience. I was wondering if you could just clarify for people that obviously finding those words in those specialist and safe places where the adult is always there, how should families then leverage that into the everyday type stuff? So using that language on people that using that language with people, sorry, who may not know anything about disability and may not know anything about, you know, reasonable adjustments or that sort of stuff. Can you say something about that for me?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the difficult things, I suppose, about having disability, and especially when you're young, is that I feel like you're always put into the position of educating. So I think for ease, it's when you're in those specialist environments and you're using language that doesn't necessarily translate to the wider community, I guess it is important for young people to understand what it means and to be able to communicate that what it means. So, you know, like, and I imagine, you know, as young children, we often do want to explain what we're talking about and express what's happening in our lives. So, you know, any specific terminology or jargon, I, as a young child, would be absolutely fine with, you know, saying, oh, I went and did this, and people are like, what's that? And I'll just explain what it means to everyone. So I guess that's one thing, making sure your child can sort of explain what they mean when they use these words, but also maybe having a list of different words that mean the same sort of thing. So, you know, if your child is using a specific terminology and no one's understanding that, then they can adjust their terminology so that they can get the accommodations that they need. Is that sort of answer that question?
Yeah, that's really helpful. So I'll throw it over to Ashley next. Ashley, on this topic of you know, being the expert in your own disability, what were your thoughts about things that families could do to build self-advocacy skills early?
Well, just to kind of explain my own personal background to everyone here, like everyone here, obviously I am disabled myself, but I also work and have a fair amount of experience in the education support scene. So a lot of my advice or tips will relate back to an education space. What I kind of had around the building the self-advocacy skills early was really kind of getting them involved in age appropriate advocacy. So for example, teaching them when to maybe say no to something that's maybe too much for them, whether that's helping them develop the ability. And I know this is a bit maybe potentially controversial, but telling them someone like teachers or potential authoritative figures that don't necessarily understand the child's disability as of yet. And then there's things like, and this also depends on the environment for the child and how safe the education environment is for the child as once they get older and they start to build up the confidence and knowledge around their disability, then potentially going into an ILP, so an individual learning plan. Environment could be beneficial, but again, I do want to stress that is kind of depending on the school, on the environment, because I am aware, especially for a lot of neurodiverse families such as myself, they can become quite volatile environments. I'm just trying to think. So, and I think as well, to go back to that really early years is probably to be open to your child about their disability and what they have. Because I think what I, to put in my personal experiences, so my original diagnosis when I was 5 years old was Asperger syndrome. And my parents never really told me that I had Asperger's. I figured it out myself as a 8-year-old. So this was still when the DSM-4 was used and this terminology was very much relevant. And I just happened to figure out, because my mum would always say, I would remember being in medical appointments and the doctors would say something on the lines of, does Ashley have any other conditions that we should know about, like that kind of normal stuff. And she'll say like, my mum would usually go between either Asperger syndrome or autistic, because that's how we were kind of brought up to believe it's kind of like the same thing. And so that's when I kind of learnt, okay, I have this. And it wasn't until I was about 8 years old when I mentioned it at something, and mum was like, how did you know that? And I think because of that, because I wasn't aware exactly what my disability was and what that meant, I've just lost my train of thought. My apologies. I think that kind of hindered me a little bit, not necessarily understanding how to advocate myself or why I'm feeling these certain ways. So yeah, they're kind of my two big ones.
Thank you, Ashley. Georgia, I'm going to throw over to you on this topic next. So we're talking about the balancing, obviously, for young children, helping them to understand who they are and the language that goes with that, but also giving them the confidence to be their experts in their own lives. So did you have any particular experiences or views on this one as a younger member on our panel?
Yeah, I do. I've actually got a story from it was grade 4 or 5 when they introduced students to writing in pen. The carnage that is the pen license, the injustice. Let's be clear, autism and neat handwriting are not good friends. The teacher might as well have told me that with enough practice, I could learn to fly. So Mum had been through the pen license circus with my sister and basically told my teacher to, quote, cut the crap, end quote, and just give it to me. Nobody asked me what I thought of that or what I wanted. The fact was, I liked the idea of being awarded a pen license, but I actually preferred writing with pencil. So I wanted to get the certificate, but keep using pencil, but nobody gave me that option. I still hate writing in cursive and would choose a pencil over a pen anytime. So all the angst was for nothing. One thing that was really helpful was when I told my parents that I couldn't do 5 days. It was just too much. I never got the time to wind down. My parents and occupational therapist met with the school to introduce decompression days, where I would have the Wednesday off just to rest. Every second week, I would finish early on the Friday, usually at around 12 p.m. We used that half day for appointments like speech, occupational therapy, and psychology, so that I wasn't having to go from a long and torturous day at school to a therapy appointment. It meant a lot that my parents listened to me, because I think that it's important for a parent to ask their child what they think. Unfortunately, even though it was obvious that I did better with a 4-day week, we had to keep renegotiating it with the school every term because their priority was still increasing my attendance, not whether or not I was engaged.
Thanks, Georgia. And I've got lots more questions about that one when we get to the topic. But can I ask you a question now? As you've moved through the school system, have you had the opportunity to introduce yourself to each new teacher each year, or is that something that happens or is done by somebody else? So do you get the opportunity to introduce yourself to the next year's teacher each year?
That depends on which teacher it is. For example, usually I get to meet the homeroom teacher before the year starts, but there's an expectation that I will already know all of my other teachers. So if I don't know, for example, my humanities teacher, I won't get to introduce myself to them, and find that quite irritating.
So, and when you say irritating, is that also because you don't get to use the language that you want to when you introduce yourself?
Well, I'm not really sure what you mean by that.
So if you wanted to explain to a teacher how you learn the best, or how you enjoy school and what sort of things you want to see in the classroom, do you get the opportunity to have that conversation?
Normally I don't.
And how does that make you feel?
Quite stressed, because a lot of that is me trying to tell the teachers what I need, but not really knowing the right way. And so then it just takes all throughout the year, they're figuring out different things, like I don't like flashing lights, or I don't like sudden noise.
Yeah. So have you got any advice that you would give to the families of young children about how their child gets an opportunity to do that?
Just give the student the opportunity to meet and explain to the teachers beforehand, and not just not their main teacher, but also their specialist teachers. And I think it's also very important to educate teachers on a students' needs and body language.
Thank you. Okay, we might move on to the next topic if that's okay. And like the first one, we've got just a couple of points on a slide before we kick into the main topic. Only a few words, actually, very few words. So our next topic is about the first few years of school. So the last webinar that we had was around school ready, and we talked about how it was like an equation where we have the school community being ready, the family being ready, and then you add into that the early childhood educators helping support the transition, which leads to a child feeling ready for school as well. So we were pretty keen to talk about the child is at school. So what do we do next, and how do we keep on advocating? So in doing this, I asked, and I'm going to start with Ashley, I asked the young people to think about what their suggestions were around, those very early years in school, and how to keep the momentum, I suppose, and keep striving to support your child to have the best experience. So I'll go to Ashley first, if that's all right. And keen to hear from you your thoughts on this topic, because I know it's dear to your heart.
Yes, it is, both professionally and personally. It's very much a bit of a I wouldn't say soft subject, but like, yeah, a bit of a passion of mine. I guess really what I kind of wanted to focus on and is a lot of the time, if you're lucky enough for your child to have some sort of diagnosis picked up within the preschool age or just before they get into kindergarten, you unfortunately have to do the song and dance again. When you have the new teachers, you have to explain the disability. You have to say, if you have an idea, depending on how long you've had the diagnosis for, what your child needs. So little Johnny might need X, Y, and Z in order to do this within a kindergarten setting. Unfortunately, there are times though that teachers, I don't necessarily want to put the blame on teachers. I think it's more the education system than actual teachers themselves. Do not necessarily believe the parents in this disability. I know for a fact this happened to me as a child, because their reasoning was they never saw me cry, so I must not be autistic, but that's a whole thing for another day. So what I actually wrote in my words was, be prepared to be that parent when it comes to supporting your child. And what I mean by that parent is constantly just checking in with your, and I do want to kind of stress this probably more in early primary years. One would hope once your child gets to middle and senior primary, this may be a bit better, but again, depends on the environment. Just constantly check in, making sure the teacher, or if your child is lucky enough to have a teacher's aide, or what we call them in the ACT here, an LSA. If your child's lucky to have an LSA, try and check in with the LSA to make sure things are getting done, making sure you're constantly just checking in with relevant, like learning support staff, principals, because depending on the school environment, a principal may be more relevant than a learning support person. So yeah, it's assistant Sue, not aide. Sorry, I should have stated that. So yes, learning support assistant LSA. And yeah, just continuing to check up, be prepared. You have to be pushy. Just because that's the way the environment is at the moment. And there's we are hoping to move it within the education space, but movement takes a long time. And just kind of from a professional sense, most of the time when I hear parents are pushy, needy, annoying, all that kind of stuff, 9 times out of 10, I can see that they're just wanting the best for their child who has a disability. There is also that 1% that need to step back, but that's not to do with our case today. So yeah, that's kind of my big takeaway, is be prepared to be that parent.
And I suppose, Ashley, just a follow-up question. If we think about, well, actually, I will save that question for Izzy, sorry.
Okay.
Georgia, I was going to go to you next. So was there anything in what Ashley was saying and the topic about, the first few years of school and having teachers and staff believe that there are things going on for you? Was there anything that you wanted to comment or share?
Yeah, I think that there's absolutely a difference between a teacher believing that the diagnosis is real and acting on it. And certainly I had some teachers who completely disregarded what my occupational therapist said, and that didn't go well. And I think that even if a regular teacher believes in it, I think that replacement teachers can be very distressing to students with disability. Like for me, sometimes I just couldn't go to school on days that there was CRT. But so my parents organized a yellow book that had all of my information in it, and the teachers never read it, so that was not fun.
Thank you, and I'm sorry that you had that experience. So you mean like when there was a substitute teacher or a relief teacher, or someone coming in that doesn't know you and hasn't read the information that's being provided to them? Okay. Izzy, I'm going to throw to you next on this one. So juggling what we were talking about before around children being the experts in their disability and building, I suppose, that skill and building the language that goes with that. What have you seen from your work that is really important in those first few years in school? If you think about, we're talking about 5 to sort of 7-year-olds, so young kids who are learning about school and learning about themselves. What would your advice be on that space?
Big question. I think, like Ashley said, like a huge part is being able to state boundaries, say no, and stick by that. I mean, it's extremely difficult as a young person to be able to say, no, I don't want to do this, and then actually have that listened to and respected. Which I guess also feeds into what the others were saying about, being that parent and sort of explaining at the get-go start of the year that, if my child is saying no, they're expressing a boundary and it's important to respect that. And of course, that won't always be respected. I guess something that's really important that I have written down here. So for context, for people who haven't watched this sort of series or seen me before, so I was diagnosed later in my schooling sort of life, so in high school. So I don't necessarily have those experiences of the first few years of school. I do have experiences of going to therapy in primary school every time French was on. I did not like French, but one of the things that I also had written down here was that every time I went to therapy, it was during French, and yet my French teacher still wanted to grade and assess me in French that I wasn't going to. So again, being that parent and being like, that doesn't make sense. Why is my child being graded? And I have another point here, but I wanted to just go back and ask you, do you have any other feedback on that question that you asked, or any other more specific questions?
Yeah, so I suppose what I'm actually fishing for, and maybe this is maybe this is the parent in me, is I suppose, what are some little opportunities in life that parents can practice some of those skills? So, and then therefore use them at school, because school is where the really challenging 13-year journey begins and forms so much. So what are some of the little opportunities in a child's life that you think and that would mean something to you for parents to support their child to express their view and those sorts of things? Anything that comes to mind, anybody?
First thing that comes to my mind, easily speaking, is when your child is having a tough time, that might include like sort of tantrum behaviors, tears, all those sorts of things. Instead of, I know sometimes, being a nanny, having been a nanny myself and working with children, sometimes when it happens frequently, you're like, oh no, not again. You're not the most accommodating person. But every time that sort of happens, reinforcing or going through a process with the child of being like, okay, what is wrong? Why is this happening? And allowing them or helping them with the words to explain what's happening. Because, when a child can, gets upset and then can sort of do deep breathing exercises or something like that, and then explain, be like, I'm really upset because of this, or this is overwhelming me. Those are the things that will help them advocate in the school setting. So going beyond saying no, or going on beyond saying, I don't want to participate in this activity or whatever, if your child can then say why or what it's doing for them, they're more likely to be heard, I suppose.
Thank you, Izzy. Ashley, can I throw over to you on this one?
Yeah, so I just kind of wanted to go back a little bit in terms of because I am finding there is a common occurrence speaking around specialist classes. So that might look like here in the ACT, that might look like something like a language, an art, if you're lucky, and maybe PE in a early primary setting. And I've actually had the lucky opportunity of being a teaching assistant in a specialist classroom setting, more specifically Japanese, as I do speak Japanese. And I was in there for about a year roughly whilst I was training to become a learning support assistant, and I have found a lot of specialist teachers are the last to know what is actually going on with students, and that involves disability. And so I'm not necessarily saying give them a break, but I think as well parents may need to take, if you are at a school, because I don't know about everyone else, but my primary school experience, you had one teacher, you had a RFF teacher, I can't remember what that stands for, I think that's like release time or something, in New South Wales, and that was it. So I think it's important to kind of talk about what a primary school might look like now, is giving that information also to your child's designated year level teacher, but also if they have some sort of specialist teacher, whether language or whatever, getting in touch with them and outlining expectations with the what the goals of your child, and opening up a proper conversation line with them. Because I just wanted to kind of add on that, because specialist teachers are kind of the last to know about things, so I think potentially beneficial to kind of help that and help protect disabled children in these environments is to kind of making sure, again, being that parent and making sure absolutely everyone knows about your child's disability. So yes, I just wanted to put that out there.
Yes, and I think, Sue speaking, I think that's a really important point. And at a very practical level, I'll just explain it in the context of what I've experienced, where if you have a child in primary school, they obviously have a classroom teacher. So that's the one teacher that does most of the lessons. But more often than not, that classroom teacher will take their 20 to 30 first year primary school students to the music room, leave them with the music teacher, and go and have some peace and quiet.
So what's common in the ACT is usually it will be like a designated day. So the Thursday might be the specialist day. So they'll have Japanese in the morning, PE in the afternoon, and maybe art or music in their like late afternoon home time kind of situation. So yeah, I just kind of wanted to add that in because we're kind of talking from a past primary school experience, but as someone who works in primary school, I am aware it's kind of evolved. I know this was a thing when I was in primary school, not necessarily where I was, but yeah, it's becoming a more common thing. So I think that was just kind of important to add.
And it's one of the challenges, I suppose, in a school setting where the family and certainly the child may not be aware of what the timetable is actually going to look like. Yes. When they start school. Yes. And that they won't necessarily be able to come home and communicate with their family that, you know, the idea that there's this classroom teacher and then there's these other rooms we go to or these other teachers that come in. And that complexity, both in for people who need, for young children who need to understand what's going to happen next, may need a visual timetable.
Yeah. Or just even because it's very specialist, again, from my experience working specialist curriculum is very hard to modify. It's not, so modify, what I mean by that is changing, if needed, a curriculum support, sorry, I just dropped something, within for the child, which then ideally goes onto the individual learning plan that I discussed before. It's very hard to, and because I've done it, I've tried it, to modify and support children in these classes as an LSA, as a learning support assistant. So yeah, I think we really need to push a little bit to provide support in those kinds of areas. But yeah, that's.
I mean, if we could take another classic example, and Georgia, I'd be interested in your experience here, and maybe it's just a Queensland thing, but the dreaded recorder. And is it fair to say that every state and territory at some point inflicts the recorder on, Izzy's nodding. Georgia, did you ever have to learn the recorder at school, or have you blocked that memory out?
Yes, I did, and it was not a fun time.
So if we're thinking about that experience and the sensory overload, that's obviously, you know, one of those classic things that you can think about where, you know, everyone is expected in the classroom to do this activity, and you know, it would be ideal, it would be appropriate and reasonable that adjustments are made for people who need different things in that space.
Yes, you would think so, but unfortunately, there were no other options, at least not when I was at school in my day. But yeah, I think that the recorder should have been opt-in, opt-out, because that, like I said, was really not a fun time.
The challenge that we needed to overcome around the recorder was not being able, my daughter was not able to blow. So fortunately, in the modern space these days, they have this thing called GarageBand, which is an app on your iPad, which you can make the same sounds as the dreaded recorder and use your fingers to create those sounds. So a fairly simple modification and an adjustment, but yes, I think we were attempting rocket science, it would appear, to try and get that adjustment. Okay, it is 11:44 in Victoria, New South Wales, and the other places that take that time, Australian Eastern Daylight Time. So we're going to take a 5-minute break. So if I could get you to come back at 11:50. So in technically 6 minutes time, if you have an Apple device. And if you want to turn off your cameras and sound and just have a break, please. Thank you, everybody. So we're back, and just wanted to have a quick chat about what's on the slide first. So this is our final topic for this webinar, and we wanted to talk about doing school differently. And there's lots of information out there where you will find options around schooling and what that can look like. So I would encourage you, if you're looking for information about approaches to schooling, whether it be settings or or types of schooling, to go probably first to your state or territory website and check out what the official information is, and then have a chat to your school, because obviously it depends on your particular area. And I suppose that the challenge that you're trying to address. So some of the things that we want to get into is the difference between the pressures on attending and the need for students to be engaged. We wanted to touch on how to build a sense of belonging, and also how to take the emotional load off children to adapt and fit in. So, Georgia, I'm going to go to you first, but I'm conscious that in the earlier topic, you talked to us about some of the different adjustments that had been made to your timetable. You were talking about decompression and other things. So I wanted to throw over to you to get your thoughts, please.
Schools are told that it's important for children to attend as much as possible, and they aren't very flexible about this. For some kids like me, it's a case of quality versus quantity. If I have to attend 25 hours of classes a week, I'm overwhelmed and I don't end up getting much benefit out of any of them. I find I do much better if I attend less classes and can really concentrate on those. As I said earlier, decompression days can be a really big help. Having a modified timetable with some downtime is helpful too. For example, at primary school, I could opt out of PE, Italian, and art if I needed to. Mind you, my PE teacher was not on board with this and gave me a hard time if I opted out of her class. But downtime to look after your mental health should be encouraged. I can't comment on how to build a sense of belonging because unfortunately I've never felt like I belonged at school.
Thanks, Georgia. And I'm sorry that you haven't felt that. I was wondering maybe what are the spaces there where you do feel like you belong, and what does that look like when you are feeling that?
Well, at my primary school, there really weren't many places like that. But at my high school, there's a building that is designated for students having a hard time called Student Services. And I feel very comfortable and safe there.
And is that because of the people there, or is it how it's set up?
I'd say both. My current school, all of the staff members at Student Services are trained and they always know what to do, and they're quite happy to talk to a student or just leave a student alone if that's what they need.
I'm conscious of asking you too many questions and grilling you on obviously. Oh, thank you. That's very generous, but of obviously what's been a long process to get to somewhere that you feel relatively comfortable. But do you have any particular points of advice for families or young people that are trying to get that attendance versus engagement thing right?
I think it's really important for parents to be able to say, no, my student's not doing that.
Yep. And is there something like, could you notice in your school when they finally got it and they finally worked out that this is actually the better way, that you and your family are advocating for something that's actually going to make you more successful? Like, was there something where they actually got it?
Yeah, I think that they actually got it very quickly. And I think part of that was, instead of telling me that I had to do more therapy, undergo more, I don't really know what the word is, but processes to learn how to communicate with others, how to read body language, and how to behave as I should, and sort of how to mask when I have to. And I think it's good that instead of making me go under all that stress, they educate the students at my school about disability. And I think that's really important.
That's fantastic. And Georgia, I really do appreciate you sharing your experiences on this stuff, because I know that it's quite recent and it's quite a big deal in your life. So I really do appreciate that. Thank you. I'm going to throw over to you, Izzy, and something, I suppose, with the benefit of a little bit more time in this space. Masking. Can you explain to us what masking is and how, from your perspective, it has created, I suppose, challenges and what you'd like parents to hear of the idea of masking, please?
Yeah, so masking is, I guess for me, it's trying to fit in with societal norms and each individual, each group, and what I perceive, they want me to be, I suppose. And it's not something that, I could turn on and off. So, even though I love my family very dearly and I can often be myself around them, I'm also often masking around them, and it's not something that is intended, and it's not something that anyone should be offended by or anything like that. I know sometimes people get the idea of, oh, like, you don't have to mask around me, do you? Or like, you feel safe, and it's like, that's not the same thing. Even if I do feel safe in a certain situation, like, I won't necessarily unmask. Sometimes it's more about me than it is about you. So yeah, I guess understanding your child, what that looks like, and being able to, like Georgia was saying, allow people to decompress. I think Georgia wants to add something to this.
Yeah, I think that it's important that people know that just because someone's masking doesn't mean that they're nervous to mask in front of that person. And I think that sometimes it can be an issue of the person with disability more than the person that they're with. And I think that one of the good things, because I moved to a Catholic school after primary school, and I think that one of the good things about that is that they don't pressure this child to mask or even to not mask, and that they tend to care a lot more about a student's well-being than about their education. But of course, they still care about the student's education.
Izzy speaking. I think that feeds really nicely into taking the emotional load off children, and what you described, Georgia, about how, when a school focuses on the child's well-being, that takes an emotional load off children. When you're not expecting children to be a certain way, or, if I am stimming or doing weird things, not telling me to stop doing that, or making me feel guilty about that. Just let me do it, and even I understand in the home environment it can sometimes be a bit different to school, and you might be like, oh, you can do these behaviors in a home setting, but don't do it at school, when other people can see you. Try and break down those barriers and those biases, because any unconscious biases you have about disability will be taught to your child who has a disability, and then they'll grow up within these confines of these biases that you have. And it takes a lot to unpack those, especially when you're dealing with your own disability and your own existing in the world, and you have these, like, something I often talk about is how, even us with disabilities have our own unconscious biases, and it's an ongoing process to unpack those. So, you know, if you can do any like online quick simple unconscious bias sort of training and get up to date with, you know, what biases might I have. Also, finding the disabled community in your area and your space and learning from them, learning from people online, like disabled influencers. It's not until you start like having conversations with community that you understand how people perceive these biases, especially if you yourself don't have a disability. So sorry to go on that little rant. That's something I'm passionate about.
Not at all.
and
I think that's really helpful information and very, very practical as well. I was just wanting, actually, Izzy or Ashley or Georgia, I don't jump in. I know there's a lot written at the moment about, say, autistic young women or people who identify as female gender, and the idea that masking is more prevalent for people. And just, I suppose, some of the things that I've read recently try and boil it down to, you know, ways to overcome the masking. And I suppose, Izzy, I just want to reflect on what you said, which was, you know, the masking isn't really about the person who you're interacting with. It's about you. So it's yours to own. So did you have any reflections on that?
I guess sometimes, you know, for me, masking can make me feel safe. It doesn't open me up to potential prejudices that people might have if I unmask. So yeah, that sort of push for people to be able to unmask, whilst I think it is really important people are able to unmask and be respected and safe in that space, also recognizing that people might not feel safe to do that. And it's kind of that balance between, you know, the movement of becoming more accessible and more understanding of disability versus where we actually are right now. So, you know, even though as a community, we are working towards awareness, we're working towards accommodations and accessibility, a lot of spaces aren't there yet. So, you know, it's sort of a different conversation saying, yes, you should be allowed to unmask versus am I safe right now in the environment that I'm in to unmask? And I wanted to touch quickly and say that sort of the things I mentioned about joining or finding your disabled community, a lot of that exists in online spaces. And, you know, your young child is probably not going to be in those online spaces, but you can be, and you can learn from people with disabilities. But there is something very special and that builds a sense of belonging when you find your community, particularly the disabled community. So, you know, for your young child, find those spaces where other young children with disabilities are, yeah, just where they are, and join those spaces and get your kids to, yeah, because I don't know, even if you can't build as a parent, you can't build or a caregiver, you don't necessarily have that much sway in a school environment on how your child builds their sense of belonging. You can find those supports outside of school.
And I think some of the feedback that we hear from parents and families, caregivers, is how to find that balance between only being in places where there are other children with disability and being in their local community, and you know, how do they find the balance, and, you know, creating opportunities, and how to do that successfully from the child's point of view. And one of the good pieces of advice that was given to me that I found helpful as a parent is, what is my child interested in? And maybe there are places where there are children with disability who are also interested in that, and maybe it's something you do with a whole bunch of peers of the same age who may or may not have a disability. So Ashley, I'm sorry we haven't come to you yet. And I know this attendance and engagement area is obviously something you experience every day, both in your professional environment. So keen to get your thoughts.
I must admit, since we've had this webinar, I've just remembered my own personal attendance-based issues that I do kind of want to share with you guys. So like Georgia, I had a lot of like sensory-based issues facing school, noise, all that kind of stuff that wasn't really taken care of, but that's another story for another day. The main one I want to focus on is once this is my kind of my senior primary years, but this is still really relevant because this would happen to in a younger sense as well. When I was in about year 5 to year 6, I had to start tutoring due to some issues around family, getting diagnosed with dyslexia and just some catch-up stuff. My parents thought it'd be better to have remedial one-on-one classes or like 3-to-1 classes just to support me. And we were so I was in like a proper institution. It was Learning Links for anyone that's in New South Wales. I know they're still quite well known. And so yeah, I kept on going. I think it was every Monday I'd do about a half day. I'd do first half in school, and then at about 11 o'clock I'd go over to Learning Links and do stuff at Learning Links. And about a month and a half getting into it, my parents, no contact, no heads up from executive staff, actually got a cease and desist letter from the school threatening to contact child services due to them taking me out of school and not having approved leave. I think that's what it was referred to back then. Despite this, because we had raised, well, my parents had raised, I think, with my teacher and the relevant people within the education, my primary school, saying Ashley will be taken out for XYZ days, timings, as she's doing this. And as well, prior to that, I was seeing a psychologist once a month in my earlier years. And so there would be, I think I'd finish up early on a Friday back then. So it's not like I hadn't done something like this prior in my life. And a lot of that ended up having to be, long story short, we had a bit of a complaint to I think it was the superintendent from memory, and the superintendent basically told the principal to pull his head in. So yeah, that's the upshot of that. I could go on for a bit longer on that. And I've also had some other ones around. I do remember it was about year 3, so more middle primary. We had as we've just talked about before, and again, I'm not necessarily bagging relief teachers. I'm a relief teacher's aide myself. I know how hard it is being relief staff, but this was, so it was a relief teacher, but it was a student teacher taking control of us. This was like the end of the day on a Friday, sensory overload, had enough. It was PE. PE was always my worst subject. And my mum saw me. This was like at like 2:55 or something. So parents are starting to come in, can see what's going on. Mum saw me quite upset and very much over it. So I have memories of her taking me into, because I assume the substitute teacher was on some sort of relief. She was like a long-term substitute because my normal teacher was off doing something else. And I just remember my mum kind of going to her being like, hello, autistic here, you should have had some sort of support here. This didn't happen, I'm taking her home. And this was like 2:55, 2:56, and the bell went at 3, so like, yep, okay, bye. As mum's walking me out, the student teacher actually stops my mum and refuses to let her come with me. She thinks it's a great idea to then have a screaming match in front of children, in front of me, to my mum, who was just wanting to remove me from the situation because I was in sensory overload. So yeah, I've had my fair share of personal attendance-based issues. I think though, because from a professional sense, it is such a hard thing to navigate, especially from an autistic student's point of view, neurodiverse student's point of view, because we could either need attendance support for myriad of things, so therapies, in my case, some sort of remedial stuff because the school didn't teach you properly, but I digress. Yeah, so it's very hard to have the ability to go to the teacher and be like, hey, my child needs X, Y, oh, probably more principal at this age, needs X, Y, and Z done. Can you support me? And I'll just finish this up and then I'll let you speak, Izzy. So yeah, it's just, yeah, it's a very hard topic. I don't know how to give advice on it because it is very specific to your child's circumstances and what is going on. I just think, going back into what I was saying, it's just a matter of having to be that parent when needed. If you think this is best for your child, and if you think if health professionals such as OTs have been mentioned, psychs, whatever your child has as their allied health professionals, if they think they need it, just kind of fight for it until you can get something in. So I think that's all I'll kind of say. Izzy, what did you want to add?
Thanks, Ashley. Izzy speaking. When you were speaking about attendance, I just had a brainwave. I was like, I've got to add this in. I remember a few webinars ago, we were sort of talking about finding your support person, finding your person who will go sort of above and beyond their role to support you, which, it's not something that we would like. We would like for everyone to be paid for all the extra time and overtime that they put into us. But unfortunately, the education system is built as such that you often need someone who understands the system to be able to support you and navigate that. So for me, I was fighting for a very long time to have reduced attendance because following a semester where I had an attendance rate of half a day. And so I was basically saying, I can't come into school anyway. It would be really great if you could be a bit lenient so that when I am well enough to come into school, I'm not coming in for a full week. And I had to fight very hard for that. And it wasn't until I found someone who was the new head of faction. I think it was a maths teacher, but I was in green faction and he came around and he was new, so he wanted to meet all the students. And I sort of told him about my situation, and he was fantastic because he knew the system, he knew the people to talk to about my needs, and he sort of made everything happen. So I essentially ended up like having meetings with him, being like, these are the accommodations I need, how can we get there? And he would do all that work on behalf of me. So if you can find anyone, even if it's, let's say you're like year 1 teacher and you're now in year 3, but they know you well and they know your accommodation needs, and they can go and privately speak to a new teacher about, how to best help you and support you in that space. Hold on to those people. And, whilst we can't necessarily pay them for the work that they do show that you really appreciate their work and those sorts of things.
Yeah. And I just want to kind of quickly add, because that's amazing that you managed to find someone, because I must admit, as a teacher's aide, my first thought would be learning support and go to learning support. And because I assume your school had some sort of learning support department area, whatever. I just find it quite amazing that a teacher who I assume wasn't necessarily attached to the direct learning support was able to offer help and support you. I'm just kind of, because obviously this is my professional hat coming on. The first kind of go-to for me, and I think in most circumstances, because Izzy's is a very rare circumstance, is your learning support team, because the learning support team, the idea of the learning support team is to advocate for your child's needs, or their needs if it's a high school year, and provide support on that. So I just wanted to say that was quite amazing. So
I was Izzy speaking, I was definitely very lucky, especially as this is just like a random maths teacher that he could like go in and make all those connections. I think sometimes my experience with student services / the principals at the time was quite negative, and they didn't believe that my diagnosis existed, sort of situation.
Okay, yeah.
So sometimes, most of the time, I think student services learning support, particularly in primary school, should be much better than that. Sometimes, depending on the school, you'll have a very terrible experience, but there are people out there who are willing to help.
Yeah.
I'll pass over to Georgia.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that I have a teacher like that as well, and she was my year level coordinator last year, and she did a lot for me, and because of her I was a lot more motivated to attend my classes even though they were online, which was horrible for me. And I still talk to her about a lot of things. So I think that, yeah, it is really important and beneficial to have a teacher like that who you feel like you can go to.
Sorry, I was talking to myself then. Thank you, Sue speaking. I just, I suppose we were talking about carrying the emotional load. So, and I suppose it lines up with what we were talking about before at the beginning about having the child as the expert and building their self-advocacy. One of the things I find helpful as a parent is to keep notes about times when adjustments have been successful. So I'm carrying that load of keeping that log and keeping that sort of like memory of school experiences. And one of the reasons I find that log very helpful is there will be some people in my daughter's life who want to defer to the experts rather than listen to me as the parent. So if I'm able to frame an example or frame a story, you know, I remember in year one when so-and-so did this, I think Eliza was quite successful in this instance. So it's not my advice, it's the experience they've already had at school, and that log of successful things is something I can defer to. And sometimes it's about you know, being able to identify how this situation is similar to a previous situation where you've maybe been able to work something out. Ashley.
I just want to add, this is more from a professional sense and a personal sense, but yes, fully agree. To any parents out there, document absolutely everything. It has saved me a bunch of times. It has saved my parents when trying to stick up for me a bunch of times. Yeah, just document everything, not going into exactly everything that we've discussed, Sue, but I remember you talking about how there's been changes in allied health professionals with your child and how they're not remembering everything, and there's not a clear line of communication coming through to your child and what's needed for your child. So yeah, I just really wanted to emphasize document absolutely everything. So yes, that's what I just wanted to add there.
Because I think and we're sort of eating into our Q&A time, but I think this discussion is bringing out some really good points. But yeah, it's that you know, a lot happens in a school term. So if the family member is able to keep that record, then I suppose you're in some ways protecting your child from that responsibility to always self-advocate, but you know, they're still able to be the child that they are because you're carrying all that information. I think that's one of the points I wanted to make today, is that's our job as parents and family members, is to carry that emotional load in that space, particularly as we're talking about young children. So we'll wrap up this topic here, and I suppose keen to hear if anyone from our audience has any questions or whether there are any other questions before we move on to some final reflections. Liz.
Thanks to all the panel. I found that really interesting. My question is actually for Ashley, but also open to any of the other panelists if you want to have some input. But I'm going to go back to the very beginning and when we talked about self-advocacy and inclusion. And Ashley, you mentioned that an individual learning plan. And I just wonder, in terms of self-advocacy, were you included in the development of the individual learning plan? And if so, how were you included?
No, short answer, no, I wasn't. And that's why I stress with, I was kind of included. I take that back a little bit. Mum would have some, like, because it's usually my mum that would do them. Mum and I would have a conversation beforehand, and then she would kind of go in and advocate for me. But also going back to, that's why I kind of stressed, because although we want to imagine that children with disability will go to a perfect school environment, will have no issues whatsoever, will have no disability discrimination towards them, the Disability Education Act will be in perfect form. That's just unfortunately not going to happen, and that was very much the case in my primary school years, and a little bit in my high school years as well. And unfortunately, because of the volatile, because it was very volatile, the relationship I had in primary school with with the school and all that kind of stuff, my mum and dad chose not to bring me in for ILP journeys, because they were just very volatile. And so that's why I do want to kind of stress, if your child's environment is not okay, to bring them into situations like that. Because another reason why my parents didn't bring me into them was because a lot of ILP meetings, you have to talk about your child in their worst day. And my parents didn't want me to hear that, which I can understand. But yeah, I just wanted to kind of, stress, if you can do it, great. But if you can't, that is okay too. There is other ways to do it.
Oh, thank you for that, Ashley. Yeah.
Sue speaking. Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Ashley. I am going to put our three panelists under pressure and ask them for their final reflections, and conscious that this is the final webinar in this series for CYDA. Obviously, you'll hear from CYDA in other instances, and you will most certainly hear from the three young people in other places. But thinking about early childhood and, the range of topics, what's the piece of advice or the call to action? Because we love a good call to action at CYDA. What is the call to action that you have for the adults in young children's lives that you would like them to hear? And I'll throw first to Georgia. I'm going to put you under pressure, sorry.
How dare you? My main piece of advice is just listen to your child. I think that sometimes adults can assume that because they're older than their child that they must be right. And I think that that's just such a foolish thing to think. And it also teaches the child a really negative lesson. So just listen to what your child has to say. And because I feel like it's a two-way street. Anyway, that's all from me.
Thank you, Georgia. I think also one of the things I've learned from that with a child who doesn't use spoken language is to look very carefully at body language and physical responses to situations, and look for the soundtrack or the themes in her life, because I'm not necessarily getting that spoken communication. So thank you, I appreciate that. Izzy, I'm going to throw to you next. Your final reflections.
Mine is going to be very similar to George's. The young person with disability is the expert of their experience. And I think everything you do should reflect that and encourage that. So, that's from self-advocacy skills to encouraging them to self-advocate, or demonstrating what advocacy looks like for them, to even just the way that you speak about their disability to them. I'm obviously online a lot. Okay, maybe not obvious to you guys. I'm online a lot, and I'm especially on TikTok and Instagram, where a lot of the disabled community exists, and there's a stark difference between the community of disabled people who are advocating for themselves versus what I will brand autism mums. And that is obviously not all mums of people with autism, but this specific brand of parenting of people with disabilities is people who use euphemisms like, you know, I have a special needs kid, who sort of talk about how special and precious their child is, and like in the context that they are different from other people because they can't do everything, but they're special. Your child can do many things, and you know, just because you might not be able to imagine how they can do it doesn't mean that they can't do it. So, you know, always centering your child, sorry to get a little bit controversial there. I just wanted to state that, you know, really as a parent, really be careful about the ideas and the language that you are sort of putting onto your kids, even if well-intentioned. Think about, you know, think about them when they're grown up, or think about them in their teen years, and how what you're saying as they're growing up might impact them and their self-worth and their ability to believe in themselves. So yeah.
Thank you, Izzy. So speaking and not being controversial at all, this is the clarity that family members like myself crave to hear directly from young people. So no, thank you. Ashley, going to give you the last word on your final reflection.
Awesome. I might this is more probably directly towards educators, because I'm aware educators are also watching this, and we've had enough kind of explanation around parenting based stuff. I'm more specifically talking about teachers in this sense, pre-service teachers or teachers that are doing their masters that have an option to do a special needs subject. For the love of God, search up stuff that's out of the special needs curriculum within your university. A lot of it is not suitable for what the classroom is actually like, and this is coming from someone who has taken these special needs classes. A lot of it will not help you. A lot of it is going against what we have spoken about today. A lot of stuff that could really be done around. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. Shocker.
So this stuff wouldn't be helpful from the special education curriculum.
Yeah, from learning about supporting children with disability. I'm not necessarily talking about special education itself. Yep. I'm talking about taking a subject, because it's usually known as special education. Please outsource products around content that's written by disabled people, especially when it comes to autism based stuff. A lot of the stuff, again, is not correct. It is, I would argue, setting you up for failure. So just on that, just please look outside of the square you are given within your spaces. And for LSA or teachers' aides, support staff, all those kinds of people, please listen to people that know the disability. There are a lot of times I've come into this space at 19, I'm now 22, and I am still facing a lot of issues where, because people see my age and I am in a position that's predominantly made of for older mothers or mothers who are trying to fit in work for their children, I am not taken seriously because of that. And we just really, in the education space, we need to listen to people around us who have the disability and source disabled creators' content to teach us about the disability. So yeah, I have noticed we're out of time, kind of, but yeah, that's all I'll say.
No, that's really a very important reflection, Ashley. Thank you. Yeah, looking for content outside the curriculum. That sounds like a good idea.
Yeah.
So we are out of time. The last two slides, which Maddie's going to help us with, are just reminding you where you can get this content, and we're keen to have your feedback, please, on your experience of this content. This content is not going anywhere. It is going to be there pretty much forever. So please jump into it, access it as you need it. And also conscious that we've raced through a lot of pretty meaty stuff today. So if you have any concerns or any things that you would like to discuss. On the next slide, we've got obviously the support options that are available for you. And we've also put in there some of the big state and territory organisations that can support in this space too. If in doubt, head to the CYDA website where you'll find the help options as well. Last but certainly not least, I would like to say thank you very much to Izzy, Ashley and Georgia, who have been key components of obviously today's webinar, but also our previous discussions. And it has been a privilege and a pleasure to have you involved, and I feel that we get as much out of these sessions as CYDA staff in working with you and hearing your stories and hearing your advice to families, and I certainly take it on board. So thank you for sharing parts of your life. I appreciate that it is not always easy. So letting us in that little bit and sharing with us has been really, really helpful. So thank you, everybody. And this is the end of the webinar. I'll get the young people to hang on, but for our attendees, thank you very much to our Auslan interpreters. Thank you very much and take care. Thank you.